Okay, hi everybody. It's Imogen and I back to do another little kind of Q&A session. And today's topic is all about heat or ice for recovery purposes. It's a kind of sometimes still quite a big debate, I would say, between kind of certainly when we're looking in the sports therapy area, as to which is best or what to use when, and also just for general injuries as well. Could be any kind of injury that we might be considering using either of those as therapies for something like that. So kind of before we get into it, one of the things I want to bring to everybody's attention is the protocol, which probably most people have heard of, or particularly if you're someone who's ever done something along the lines of a first aid course, for example. You might have heard of the RICE protocol. So RICE being kind of recovery, ice, compression, elevation, and that's the kind of protocol that we should follow when we have an injury, whether it's sporting or any other kind. Now, just a little bit of background on RICE. This was developed by, this protocol was kind of introduced or invented, if you like, by a doctor in the 70s, and it's kind of stuck, really. You know, a lot of people will still think of that protocol, but what's quite interesting as we go into kind of the pros and cons of both, or what we should use kind of heat or ice for, is that the doctor himself actually went back on his own protocol, kind of renounced his own advice, as it were, and not to say again there's anything kind of totally wrong with that, depending on the situation. But in terms of a kind of foolproof protocol that we use on all occasions, as we can probably discuss, we wouldn't always necessarily use that. So what we're going to do is, in kind of terms of how we would use that for our clients and what our recommendations would be, Imogen, how would you kind of give advice to one of your clients if they came to you and said, heat, ice, what should I be using? When should I be using it? In what scenario? I'm sure you've had these kind of conversations before.
Yeah, definitely. It kind of comes down to the situation as to what I always sort of say is the right one to do. So, like sticking with the like what you were saying with the rice stuff, um, then when people are asking, like the way I always tend to kind of as a baseline to explain it is like the icing in that rice protocol is really helpful for like an acute injury. So if you've just done something, it's helped to kind of manage in those sorts of settings, which I think is generally what most people kind of understand and do use it for. I find it's then more to do with the when there's pains and stuff later, or like when there's more like the spasm type or muscular type pain, or beyond that sort of like 24 48 hour window, people never really know then what one to reach for. And as a general rule of thumb of how I tend to kind of give people advice on it is that I'm like, if it's feeling more like a muscle soreness, if it's feeling like you want to rub it, then I generally suggest people to kind of reach for the heat. Whereas if there is like notable signs of that sort of like inflammation, bruising, and things like this, then you might find to a degree the icing is helpful. However, the research and sort of stuff on that these days tends to lend away from that and actually suggests that movement is probably better than the icing, just because the icing is led to believe that it actually impacts recovery.
Yeah,
Rather than
absolutely.
actually
And
helps it.
I think that is key to bring that word in quite soon in this conversation, when we're kind of comparing ice or heat, because there is an alternative, isn't there? And that is movement. You know, similarly to you, when I have someone who's kind of within an acute injury phase and they're looking for advice, and this can, it can last for up to 2 to 3 days. It depends on the extent of the injury. For some people it might take slightly longer than others, and the majority of cases using ice is great for reducing swelling, reducing inflammation, and basically just kind of reducing the pain that they're experiencing, particularly if it's someone who perhaps doesn't want to take any sort of pain medication. They would use ice as something that's going to also reduce the pain as well, in the short term. And generally, I find that tends to be no longer than, it shouldn't be really any longer than 2 to 3 days. Otherwise, they should have been having hospital treatment. They may have broken a bone, any of those kind of things, or had a scan, etc., etc. But then, once they're past that point where they need to kind of reduce the pain, or the pain isn't so much anymore, again, like you said, either heat, because heat will increase blood flow to the area. That's going to help with repair processes. It's going to start to make sure that those important kind of chemicals and metabolic processes are going on inside the body, which are going to help with repair and getting all the nutrients, whether it's through nutrition, or the amount of sleep you're getting, or how much energy you feel you have. All of those different things are going to have an impact on your recovery. But like you said, actually one of the best things to recommend these days is movement. Now, for me, obviously, again, it is unique on each individual person, but it doesn't have to mean that if you've got a lower body half kind of injury, legs, for example, feet, ankles, knees, etc., that means you have to be totally weight bearing on that. It can just be movement from seated, can't it? So it could just be, let's say they're sitting on the edge of a chair, or they come to see you, they're sitting on the edge of a massage bed, something along those lines. It is just the movement. So it might be they're sitting on the edge of their bed with their legs dangling off, and then they've got that kind of extension of the legs, and they've got that movement going on, just to again increase blood flow, get muscles kind of activating somewhat, and that movement is absolutely key. And I think almost that is becoming more the priority advice, to make sure people understand that, because the majority of the time, obviously, when we're injured, we think, well, we better not put any weight, bear any weight on that, or injure it in any further way by actually using it of any kind. So
yeah.
I tend to find that is now a really, really important piece of advice.
Very much so. And like going that, if it is really painful to move, I mean, like, even if it's to the point of like what you're saying, where you're not fully load bearing on it, there's things you can do where you're not actually actively moving it. So you could do it in terms of like just passively. So if it was the shoulder, like you can use the other arm to guide it round and stuff, so that you're not actually, but you're still creating that movement there, and you can have control as to where it's moving. Or if it's feet, you might slide it along a floor, for example, and things like that. So it doesn't have to take the load at all, but you still can introduce movement in it, like you say, because it generally is an important one.
Absolutely. And I think what we've got to remember is that our bodies are very clever, and I'm sure we've said this on previous conversations. Our body naturally knows what to do to recover from injury, and it will start that process straight away. So as we said, cold ice therapy might help in terms of kind of pain reduction, swelling, at that time, if that needs to happen. Obviously, if you can cope with the, there's a low level of pain, but there is some swelling, again, there's nothing to say that you need to reduce that swelling unless it's causing some additional harm. Or you can't use it because you have to.
Yeah, because that's essentially what you're aiming for, isn't it? It's to reduce the pain or to reduce the swelling so it can be moved again. So if it can already be moved, you don't necessarily need to do the icing because it can move.
Yeah, and a certain amount of swelling is there for a reason. It's part of the body's process of repair, and also protecting that area somewhat, so that you are aware that it needs to be protected. as a kind of physiological function and thing that kind of signals to our brain to look after ourselves just a little bit more whilst this repair process is going on. But the other thing I also want to touch on then, so I said we're not totally shunning kind of cold therapy. Obviously, there is a time and a place for it, certainly in terms of the acute injury phase. But when we're not talking about injury and we're talking about recovery, so I'm talking about recovery from sports activity. So it has become quite popular now for sports teams, individual athletes to go and use things like cold showers, ice baths. Going into cold places like cryotherapy kind of chambers, which are quite popular these days. What are your thoughts on those, Imogen?
I think it can be helpful. And I think that one comes down to how you're using it. Because I think the reason it's useful is because it's not so much the fact it's cold as so much as the change you're getting from going from one to the other, because it's then regulating that the blood flow and the circulation through, which is what you're trying to help improve with in terms of recovery, because you need the blood flow to, like you say, get the nutrients and everything in terms of that recovery. So I think it's useful, but it depends on how you're using it, and then making sure that you understand actually what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Yeah, and I think also timing, for those people, I would say, let's say you're a footballer and you've just kind of finished a match. I wouldn't necessarily recommend getting in a cold bath straight away, because again, if you've got, although you might not have injured yourself on the pitch during that match, you may well have overexerted yourself a bit more than normal. You may have little kind of those natural kind of little micro tears in your muscles where it's part of the muscle building process. But, again, that needs a little bit of kind of recovery time. And the best way to do that is to kind of stimulate the blood flow to make sure repair process is going on, which is where something like, a sports massage after something like that, or after a long distance run, like let's say you've just taken part in a marathon, something along those lines, we know that things like kind of sports massage are a great way to have a quick stimulation of blood flow to those areas that need the repair at that moment in time, in that kind of phase straight after doing exercise or participating in an event. And then once you're slightly through that phase, then of course, going to somewhere where you can get into an ice bath later down the line, that is going to be more beneficial, as cold therapy for improving, again, stimulating other metabolic processes, kind of stimulating an immune response, so good for your immune system as well. But again, I think timing can be quite key, and I think not everybody gets that right, or again are a bit kind of confused as to when to use cold therapy, when to use kind of heat therapy as well. Both can be really beneficial. I think it just depends on the what and on the where.
But it's also how, like you say, with the heat, it's like what you're using for the heat, because people will automatically think like hot packs and hot patches to apply heat, but where we're talking about movement and where you're talking about massage, they both are heat generating activities within the body. Like heat is a byproduct when you're using muscles and contracting muscles, and then the massage all is friction based into a degree, and then again you've got movement elements there, so those activities are heat-based recovery ones. So if you're using a ball, and even to a little degree, I would argue maybe stretching as well, and the mobility drills, because it's still movement. You're still moving in a way and creating that heat in the body as the byproduct from just moving. So it is still that essential basically increasing blood flow because of the vasodilation that's occurring. So
Yeah,
that's why they're useful in those sorts of times, as I would argue.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, fab. So, well, I hope that has kind of cleared up some debates that people might have been having in their own heads about kind of when should I use heat cold, whether it's, you know, for injury purposes or as an athlete or part of a sports team, and when to use them. But obviously, you know, if people have additional questions around that, there's always kind of little spin-offs. What about in this situation or this situation? Should I use it? Then what if obviously, you know, people can still get in touch with us via the normal channels, either through our websites or through social media, and quiz us a little bit more about those situations.
I've got a little tip that I
Oh,
think I told you about with what I suggest to clients sometimes if they're unsure with heat
oh
and cold.
yes, share your tip.
So I actually, this was from another therapist I saw myself with, I think it was a thumb tendonitis I had, and they suggested using like your E45 cream or some sort of body lotion and popping a couple of drops of peppermint oil in it.
Mm,
And then rubbing that into the area that's either feeling sore or has been injured and stuff, because what that does is that it's essentially the menthol in the oil, in the peppermint, that you draw in, either you feel the cooling effect or you can feel the warming effect. And having experienced it firsthand, it was the most bizarre feeling of having that coldness around where the actual essentially inflammation and that tendonitis was. But obviously the things that have led to that injury was the tension and things in my forearms. So I could actually feel the heat in the forearms where the muscles were sitting, where they were tight, and drawing in that heat to help relax. So
yeah,
that's my tip if people struggle sometimes of what to do. I'm like, try that one, you might get
absolutely.
both.
Yeah, and that is, I mean, that is a whole nother conversation, isn't it? Looking at kind of other things that we can kind of use, other forms of treatment, you know, looking into aromatherapy, and all of those kinds of things. You know, we do have an aromatherapist here at the Histon Hub, so anyone interested in that a little bit more can find out from our therapists here. But yeah, there are, I mean, there's and different things also work for or have more of an impact, should I say, or more of an effect, you know, a physiological effect than others. So it's always worth kind of, you know, trying these things out and seeing what works for you with some of those alternative methods as well. Okay, right, another great chat. We'll be back for another one soon. See you soon, Imogen. Thanks very much, everyone.